I'm Erica Lukes, host of UFO Classified. For me, life isn't simply black and white. Life is full of many unknowns. It is my goal to travel the world and to work with the world's leading experts in the hopes of making groundbreaking discoveries. Join me on UFO Classified Friday nights at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, only on KCOR.
On the river.
UFO Classified.
UFO Classified.
No more plausible deniability. Fact, fiction, or the truth. You decide. And now, the new voice of the high desert, the hostess of UFO Classified, Erica Lukes.
Plausible deniability. That is a term that was coined by the CIA during the Kennedy administration to describe the withholding of information from senior officials in order to protect them from repercussions in the event that an illegal or unpopular activities took place and the CIA became public knowledge. The term most often refers to the denial of blame in chains of command, where senior figures assign responsibility to the lower ranks and records the instructions given do not exist and are inaccessible, meaning independent confirmation of responsibility for the action is nearly impossible. In the case that illegal or otherwise disreputable and unpopular activities become public, high-ranking officials may deny any awareness of such an act or any connection to the agents used to carry out such acts. The lack of evidence to the contrary ostensibly makes the denial plausible, that is, credible. The term typically implies forethought, such as intentionally setting up the conditions to plausibly avoid responsibility for one's action or knowledge. In politics and espionage, deniability refers to the ability of a powerful player or intelligence agency to avoid blowback by secretly arranging for an action to be taken on their behalf by a third party, ostensibly unconnected with the major player. In political campaigns, plausible deniability enables candidates to stay clean and denounce third-party advertisements that are unethical approaches or potentially libelous. That is from definitions.net. Plausible deniability. Well, what we've seen with regard to Skinwalker Ranch is a lot of plausible deniability. In fact, clearly my shows are making some waves because websites are getting changed, people are coming out and they're trying to cover their rear ends, which is just simply not going to happen because the truth is spreading and the truth will see the light of day. When I go to Jeremy Corbell's blog, Hunt for the Skinwalker, there is a page about Camelio, and this is something we're going to be talking a lot about tonight. But at the very end of the article by an anonymous person, it says, "Finally, it is outside the scope of this article to question the legality or otherwise of subjecting United States citizens to acts of aggression and hostile trespassing, vandalism, in some cases injuries, as a result of deploying non-lethal toys in the Uinta Basin. Regardless, the ambiguity, I can't even speak English tonight, between us and them as perpetrators of these unsolved crime remains." So here we have clearly that team trying to cover their rear ends, and that's great. I suppose you can say whatever you want to say about the fact that Bigelow owned the property and he subleased, obviously very clearly, to contractors who were deploying toys. You can't wash your hands of that. Innocent people were hurt and don't know where their lives will go as a result of this. And as we see, we now know that there are many non-lethal weapons that are being deployed in theater and unfortunately are being used against American citizens. My guest this evening has a friend named Dion who was subject to some of these things, and Camelio, which is a very important book that I might add Dr. Jacques Vallée and many reference, clearly Jeremy Corbell. Camelio is a true account of what happened in Southern California when an enthusiastic and unrepentant heroin addict named Dion Fuller sheltered a U.S. Marine who'd stolen night vision goggles and perhaps a few top secret files from a nearby military base. Dion found himself arrested for conspiring with international terrorists to smuggle top secret military equipment out of Camp Pendleton. And after all of that happened, he was subject to bizarre experimentations involving cloaking, electro-optical camouflage so extreme it renders observers practically invisible from a distance. So all of these things started to happen that remarkably sound exactly like what was being used at Skinwalker Ranch on people like Chris Marks, my husband, and his colleagues. It is very interesting. We're definitely going to get into that a little bit more. Robert Guffey is a lecturer in the Department of English at California State University, Long Beach. He has a book out, Until the Last Dog Dies, Nightshade Skyhorse, that came out in 2017. I know he's got another new book out that he can talk a little bit about, and he wrote Chameleon. Like I said, this is really an important book that you all should get, A Strange But True Story of Invisible Spies, Heroin Addiction, and Homeland Security. He also authored Spies and Saucers and other books. Again, we're going to talk about this, but I want to just say that, Robert, your work by the day is becoming more and more important to things that I'm discovering. And first of all, welcome to the show. But secondly, thank you for actually putting forward your friend's story. This is really important.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on. When I wrote the book, it was almost like putting a message in a bottle and throwing it out into the ocean. I had no idea the parallels between this story and so many other things that were happening. Those parallels weren't clear yet, but as the book has been published and people have been reading it, I've been getting feedback and feed forward, as Marshall McLuhan would say. And it's amazing how, for example, you mentioned Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée mentions the book Chameleon in his new book, Forbidden Science 4. I'm pleased that he mentioned the book in his book, though he says in the footnote that Chameleon is presented as fiction. I'd like to underscore the fact that it's not fiction. In fact, in the subtitle, it says A Strange But True Story. So it is, in fact, a true story. The only thing that's changed about it are I changed some of the names, except those people who are already public figures, like Richard Schoengert, the scientist who is featured in the book. And so when George Knapp had me on Coast to Coast, to prepare for that, I went back and reread the Skinwalker book that he wrote with Colm Kelleher, and apparently the reason he invited me on the show is because Jacques Vallée had told Colm Kelleher to read Chameleon. You need to read this. Then Colm Kelleher told George Knapp, you should have this guy on the show. So then George Knapp read it, and then he sent a copy to David Paulides, who wrote Missing 411. And a lot of people have contacted me and told me I bought the book because I heard David Paulides mention it in his interviews. And in fact, when I was on that night, George Knapp and I talked about the distinct parallels between the Skinwalker Ranch scenario and everything that I talk about in Chameleon. And in fact, when a caller called in that night and asked me if I thought there were any parallels between my book and Missing 411 by Paulides, and I had seen a lecture that Paulides had given about Missing 411 in L.A. At a UFO meeting, MUFON meeting, and at the time hadn't really thought about the connections. Then when this caller called in and mentioned it, I said, that's a very interesting thought. I can't really comment on it because I haven't really thought about those connections too much. But since then, I've been contacted by just scores of people who have talked about encountering optical camouflage-like, predator-like creatures out in the forest and in urban areas as well. Just like Damien. I don't know if do you want me to give you background on Damien's situation?
You know what? I would absolutely love that, because there are new people that are listening and don't have the idea of the full story. So thank you. Sure.
Okay. So it goes back to 2003, and it was in July, and in fact it was July 12th, and I remember that because that was the day I was initiated in the third degree of Freemasonry, and I mention that because it ties in later on in the story. My friend Damien, in the book I call him Dion Fuller. His real name's Damien. I'd known him since my 16th birthday. That's when we met in high school. So I'd known him for a long time. I was living in Torrance, California. He was living in the Pacific Beach area of San Diego. He had just gone through a breakup, and so his life was kind of a little bit chaotic at the time, though not nearly as chaotic as it would soon become. But his house was kind of a party house. A lot of people coming in and out all the time, doing drugs, drinking, etc. And he meets a friend of a friend, this kid named Lee. Or rather, he said his name was Lee. Later, we were told his name was Doyle. This kid, unbeknownst to Damien, had gone AWOL from Camp Pendleton, the Marine base that's there in San Diego. When he took off, he stole a 9mm Iraqi gun, 23 pairs of high-tech night vision goggles, or rather, I said 23 in the book. I later learned it was 28, and maybe I'll talk about that later on. A DoD laptop computer and a truck. You might wonder how it's possible somebody could steal all this post 9/11, but he did. And he ends up at Damien's house. Some of this stuff was in Damien's house, including the laptop, and there's this party going on at night. Lee, this kid, opens the laptop computer, and a DoD symbol pops up on the screen, and immediately Damien thinks, what the hell is this? Get that stuff and get the hell out of here. And the kid says, no, don't worry. They can't track this stuff. Don't worry about it. Within moments of him saying that, there's a knock at the door. It's a woman named who identifies herself as Lita, Special Agent Lita Johnson, though that's not her real name. And she shows up, knocks on the door. There's just a couple of goons with her, and she says, we'd like to search your house, your apartment. And Damien, who was the son of a narcotics cop, was very familiar with his rights and said, no, do you have a warrant? And she said, I don't have a warrant. I can come back with a warrant. And so he said, why don't you do that? And slams the door in her face, and then immediately turns to everyone in the house and says, get out the back, because everyone's doing various illicit substances. They all throw their drugs onto Damien's living room carpet and then truck out the back. The NCIS show up along with the San Diego Police Department. Though Damien said it seemed as if they were kind of bumping into each other, working at cross purposes, Keystone Cops kind of situation. They weren't interested in the drugs at all, even though they were all over the place. They were just interested in these night vision goggles. That was the main thing. They wanted to get back these night vision goggles. And Damien says, look, I don't know anything about this. This kid's been sleeping here on my couch for like 3 nights. Damien barely knew who this kid was. They didn't believe that. They thought, obviously, if the kid's living there, then there's some definite connection between the kid going AWOL, stealing all this stuff, and ending up at Damien's house. There must be some definite connection between the two of them. So they arrest Damien, and they arrest this kid, and they take him to the local San Diego jail. They give Damien the Abu Ghraib treatment for about a week, grilling him, real like Kafka-esque scenario. It's like straight out of the trial. He keeps saying, look, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't done anything. I just let this kid sleep on my couch. No, they're not accepting that. Finally, after being in the jail for about a week, and I had called Damien that night to tell him that I had just gone through the third degree, which he knew was coming up. So I had called him to tell him, look, I'm okay. I didn't get sacrificed to Baphomet or the Triune, three-headed Masonic god. I was calling him, I'm okay. I was going to tell him that what had happened, and that it was over with. And Damien was not there. I left a message. He didn't call back the next day or the next day or the day after that, which was unusual. A whole week goes by. Finally, he calls me and tells me he's been arrested. and tells me everything I just told you. And we both think, well, that's a very strange story. Can't get stranger than that. Obviously, they figured out that you had no connection to this other kid, and it's over. The next day, Damien calls me back to tell me that he's being followed all around San Diego by these jarhead-looking guys, and not just like one person. Maybe that would seem reasonable. Maybe they're still interested, a little suspicious, send someone to tail him. No. He was describing whole crowds of people following him into a 7-Eleven, out again. He'd go to the Mexican restaurant down the street. They'd all follow him in, sit at seats around him, stare at him, but in such a way that no one else, if you weren't connected, if you weren't Damien, you wouldn't realize this was happening. And it was done in such a way where it was by no means surreptitious. They wanted him to know that they were following him around. When he first told me this, my immediate reaction was that Damien was suffering from some sort of meth-induced paranoia. I didn't think that this could possibly be happening, though I did have some familiarity with, say, MKUltra and conspiracies in general. Mm-hmm. I'd never heard of this gang stalking phenomenon. In fact, that word didn't even exist yet in 2003. And so I said to Damien, well, if this is happening, he was telling me that cars were being parked out, they'd park outside his house at night and sit there and blare the horn right outside his bedroom window. They'd shine halogen lights into his house. All this relatively mundane activity to just keep him off balance. And I said, well, if that's going on, then why don't you photograph some of the license plates of these cars that are following you around, which he did. And he sent me photographs and a list of the license plates. That list is in the book, like around page 50, I think. And I happen to know someone who worked at the DMV up in Washington State. So I send this guy the list of license plate numbers, and the guy runs them through the computer, and he tells me no such plates exist. That was the first indication that, okay, Damien's not paranoid. He's not suffering from meth-induced paranoia. There's no reason why the license plates wouldn't be in the system, because I knew they existed because I'd seen the photographs and I knew they were real. In other words, if Damien was just paranoid and thought someone was following him around, nonetheless, the license plate numbers would connect to a real car or a real person who lived in Damien's neighborhood. But they didn't exist. And it seemed to me the only reason they wouldn't exist is if they were government vehicles. So at that point, I said, okay, you got to start collecting more evidence. This kind of activity, this mobbing kind of activity, increased, and what would happen is occasionally, after a couple of weeks of this, Lita Johnson would show up at his front door. All the cars that are parked around his house would peel away, and then she would show up, knock on the door with a couple of goons with her again, and say, hi, how you doing? Have you reconsidered? Have you remembered anything that might be helpful to this investigation, particularly the location of these night vision goggles? Damien goes, no, I haven't changed my mind because there's nothing to change. I didn't know anything then. I don't know anything now. And she said, oh, okay, well, here's my card. If you change your mind, my phone number's there. And then she gets in her car, drives away, and then immediately all the cars come back. They start honking the horn again, shining the halogen lights through the windows, etc. So this harassment continues. At the time, I started just going on the internet and Googling keywords, and I came across raven1.net, and there was a little essay called All About Street Theater. Street theater was the closest phrase to what we now call gang stalking. And everything that this woman described fit exactly what Damien was going through. And I thought, that's interesting. In fact, I reprint that little essay in Camilio. It goes from there to being electronic harassment and bombarding him with complex hallucinations. He would look outside the window, and what was outside the window, which should have been there, was no longer there. Instead of being the parking lot of the Vons, now it looks like a Boris Vallejo painting with 3 moons in the sky, and completely surreal. And then he would and looking very realistic. And then he'd open up the door, and it was the scene as it had always been. It's the parking lot of the Vons. This would happen often. Then he started noticing that the inside of his apartment seemed bigger than it used to be. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And other people would see this. Friends would come over and go, "Is your house growing?" Or conversely, it might seem smaller. Then things were happening where he'd be sitting in the bed at night, and they would project the silhouette of a hand with a gun in it, and the hand would tilt down, and so that the gun was now pointing at Damien's head, and then it would tilt up again, and then fade away. At one point, he had a leather jacket sitting on the floor of his bedroom, and this kind of roiling black energy crawled across the floor, got into the black jacket, and the jacket crawled across the floor. I was on the phone with him around this time. He's describing some of this stuff to me. And Damien's been in and out of jail his whole life. He doesn't get easily scared. But as I'm talking to him on the phone, I can hear things start crashing all around the room. And Damien gets down underneath the desk, and now he sounds like he's a scared little girl, because he just tells me that all these tchotchkes up on the shelves are just like exploding. All the stuff's like coming off and just bursting apart, as if being hit by invisible bullets, which in fact is probably what was going on. I should note that he was surrounded by corporations like SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, which ties in later on with other nefarious activities, and also ATC, American Technology Corporation, which at that time was specializing in researching what is known as acoustic bullets made of sound. Sometimes he would be sitting there in the living room and all the sound would disappear. In other words, all the ambient noise would just be gone. And you might think, well, so what? but it does have a kind of Chinese torture effect when you open the door and you can hear all the sounds in the cars and everything, and then close the door, and suddenly it's like you can't hear anything. It's like you're in a soundproof room.
Right, and that happened to Chris. And pardon my interruption, but Chris, my husband, who worked at Skinwalker Ranch for 6 years, that happened to many of the people up at the ranch. So that is interesting.
That is interesting. Everything got stranger to the point where he calls me, and keep in mind I'm condensing everything a lot, I'm leaving a lot of stuff out. But he calls me one day and tells me that there are people coming into his house who he cannot see. They're there. He knows they're there. He can hear them. He can hear them breathing. And at one point, he was in the bathroom. Sometimes they would touch him. They would touch him and then leave. And at this time, all the neighbors moved out. All the neighbors who had been around him for years, they all moved out and were replaced with new neighbors.
Oh, isn't that interesting? I've got to cut you off right there because we've got to go to break. But this is all sounding so familiar. I am Erica Lukes, grateful to be here tonight with Robert Guffey, who wrote the book Camillio, a strange but true story of invisible spies, heroin addiction, and homeland security. Get the book. We will be right back.
Stand by.
This is UFO Classified with Erica Lukes.
Erica Lukes.
The phone lines are open now at 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230. Worldwide callers use Skype name KCOR Radio. More UFO Classified.
UFO Classified.
With Erica Lukes on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. After this.
The Fenton Files, where it's all connected.
You see, whoever controls technology controls the world.
Come explore a universe full of possibilities. Every Monday night at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern.
The Fenton Files.
Go where no other show has gone before.
You can deny all the things I've seen, all the things I've discovered, but not for much longer. because too many others know what's happening out there.
Whether it be UFOs, aliens, conspiracies, or even consciousness, your host, Lorian Fenton, has a file for that. The Fenton Files. Your journey to the truth is but a file away. Live, Monday nights, 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. The Fenton Files.
Incredibly intense.
Where truth is just waiting to be discovered.
Now, broadcasting in digital HD radio.
In the shadows, a voice cries out. Evidence that you're not alone.
You said my name. What is your name?
Proof that the living and the dead coexist. Or do they? Every Wednesday night, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, join writer, producer, and paranormal investigator Greg Bakken on Ghost Box Radio as he explores, interviews, and investigates evidence alongside some of the best in the paranormal community and beyond.
6 people killed.
Ghost Box Radio, Wednesday nights exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network, because the dead don't sleep. Ghost Box Radio.
Are you ready to go?
It's showtime!
Here we go, world.
You're listening to the KCOR Digital Radio Network.
Broadcasting from the heart of Las Vegas, Nevada.
Their base is so large it has to draw most of its power from the nearby nuclear fusion plant.
The future of radio is here and now.
If ever a breed was affectionate to a fault, it's the Golden Retriever. They're people dogs, pure and simple. And the Golden Retriever Rescue of Southern Nevada needs your help. If you would like to volunteer, foster, adopt, or donate, go to the Golden Retriever Rescue of Southern Nevada's website at grrsn.org. That's grrsn.org. Or call 598-GOLD. That's 598-GOLD.
You're listening to
UFO Classified with Erica Lukes, where the truth isn't hidden beneath the black lines of a Sharpie.
That's the craziest thing I've ever heard.
To be on with Erica, call 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230. Worldwide callers use Skype name KCOR Radio.
Radio contact.
Share your thoughts on the show on Twitter by using hashtag KCOR. Or head over to the live chats at KCORradio.com.
The audience goes nuts!
And now, your host of UFO Classified.
Are you ready?
Erica Lukes.
Erica Lukes.
Welcome back to UFO Classified. I want to give a shout out to all of my friends who get here and chat, support the show, send me messages, Northern UFOs. I'm really excited to get you on my show next week to celebrate my 4-year anniversary here at KCOR. I love this station. I love Tina. I have such a great following, and I want to thank all of you. And I also want to thank all the people that support the show financially, that are really out there to promote and support the truth. The truth is not an easy thing, as I am finding out firsthand. I have myself been the victim of gang stalking on the internet and really some pretty nasty harassment campaigns, people trying to discredit me. They're all coming from the same places, which is very curious to me. Certain people here in Utah who are connected to certain people in Las Vegas, which I find quite interesting. My husband was actually sent a glitter bomb after he broke some of the news about what really took place at Skinwalker Ranch, the fact that it actually was a place where they were testing non-lethal weapons, or whatever you want to call them, on people that did not have any idea. More and more is coming out. Cameleo is an important book, and I highly encourage each of you to get this book. Cameleo is a strange but true story about invisible spies, literally heroin addiction and homeland security, and it raises a lot of questions about ethics, about the treatment of people. Just because somebody is a heroin addict, somebody is convicted of a crime, somebody serves the country and puts their life on the line for our freedom. And yet they're subjected to this kind of mental torture. They're subjected to things where they will have some pretty significant health issues. It might lead to death. I mean, there are lots of things that need to be accounted for. And the more that comes forward, the more we are going to see a big tidal wave of things will be exposed. And I am just grateful to have Robert Guffey here, who is a brilliant author. Robert, thank you. I mean, it's just amazing to me, like I was saying, to look back from my first interview with you and understanding the importance of your work then, but now looking at this in this broader context and thinking, oh my Lord, this is happening all over, and there's so many things that aren't right about this.
Oh, absolutely not. And you began by talking about the plausible deniability back in the 60s. That's evolved or devolved to total deniability because they farm this stuff out to people who are ostensibly not connected to any particular government agency or to private security firms. And when the first person who ever interviewed me about Camellia was Tessa Dick, who was the widow of Phil K. Dick. Phil K. Dick, the science fiction writer who wrote A Scanner Darkly and Valis and Duane Droid's Dream of Electric Sheep, which became the film Blade Runner, and on and on. And back in the 70s, Phil Dick was harassed by COINTELPRO, by the plumbers, Nixon's gang, Liddy, and E. Howard Hunt. They thought that Phil Dick was somehow a threat. Phil Dick wrote a book called A Scanner Darkly, which was all about a narc who's infiltrating this small group of drug dealers in Southern California. And when this narc, who pretends to be just a normal slacker, drug dealer, drug user by day, when he goes back to the police station, he puts on this skin-tight blur suit, literally like an optical camouflage suit that blurs him so that other people at the police agency don't know who he is. And I remember at the time, it's so odd that later I would connect with Tessa Dick, because when I was telling Tessa Dick this story, when she read the book, she said, "Robert, thank you for writing this book. It fills in so many gaps, things that happened to me and Phil Dick back in the 70s. And I remember when all this was happening, Damien said to me at one point, it's as if these people have read Phil Dick novels and they're manifesting it in reality. And then he said, it's too bad Phil Dick didn't write happier books, because then they could have manifested those books, and then they'd be, rather than living in this dystopia, we could be living in some sort of utopia instead. But it's all indication is that Phil Dick was also targeted in this way, maybe not exactly in this way, because the technology would have been different back then, but very similar. Tessa Dick told me about how they would unplug the radio and voices would come through the radio, voices insulting them. And it wasn't just Phil Dick who heard this, Tessa Dick heard it as well. And the detail I mentioned right before the break about all the neighbors moving out, when I said that, Tessa Dick said the same thing happened. When their harassment began, all the neighbors around them moved out, and new people came in, and they're pulling in this weird equipment and machinery into their house, into the apartment next door. That's common as well. So with the blur suit that Phil Dick wrote about in A Scanner Darkly, he was really being very prescient and predicting exactly this type of technology that I'm talking about now, that Damien encountered. When he called me and told me, yeah, these invisible people are coming in, he's getting pushed over, he's getting touched, he's getting harassed, physically manhandled by these people who he could not see. Then one day he's in the bathroom and he opens the medicine cabinet, and as the mirror on the medicine cabinet, as it was in motion, he briefly could see the person behind him. And it was very small person, but in this skin-tight kind of suit-looking thing. And then he also said sometimes he would see them as these little dots, as auras in the air. He described it as some people who suffer from intense migraine headaches, they see auras. He said it kind of looked like that. It was that type of a phenomenon. Now, when he told me this, this was even stranger than anything that had happened up to that point. But I thought it made some kind of cockeyed sense that he would be able to see them while the mirror was in motion, because, of course, I was thinking, okay, what if it's some form of light-bending technology, and so the mirror is not affected by it? It wasn't a detail that Damien would just dream up. I mean, he wasn't like an optical physicist or anything. But it seemed convincing to me. Then he later told me that he was at the beach, and he saw tracks in the sand of a vehicle following him, but there was no vehicle there. So around this time, continuously, this NCIS agent, Lita Johnson, would show up again. She would say, have you changed your mind? He would say no. He even met with her for lunch at one point at a bagel shop with her superior. That's how intense this was. Her superior came along to have lunch with this seemingly random heroin addict in Pacific Beach. That conversation didn't go well. And so I said to Damien, listen, why don't you give me her phone number? I'll call her. And I half wanted to talk to her, just kind of like to verify that she was real. Not that I really disbelieved him, but I just wanted to make sure. So I call the phone number. She answers the phone. She identifies herself as NCIS agent Lita Johnson, and I say, hey, I'm a friend of Damien. I live here over in Torrance. My name's Robert Guffey. My friend tells me that he's being followed around. Are you following him? She was completely flushed. I mean, very surprised that she was getting a phone call about this, and very much did not want to be talking to me. And every response she had for me was a kind of classic CYA kind of response. I said, are you following my friend? And she immediately said, no one in my agency is currently following your friend. That kind of like crippled, broken back, legalistic language. Every response was like that. And then near the end, I said, well, look, do you mind if he leaves town? Because at this point, I thought the only way to get this harassment to stop was if Damien leaves town. I naively thought that would make it all go away. A lot of people think that. And she said, well, I would not advise him to leave town. And I said, well, if you're not planning on arresting him and you're not investigating him and you don't have any interest in him, then why couldn't he leave town? And she said, well, it would just make things difficult later on, which made no sense. If they have no interest in him, then why would it make things difficult later on? The rest of the conversation didn't go well. She kind of implied that Damien was crazy. The transcript, the exact transcript of that conversation is in Camilio. At that point, Damien ran into a beachcomber down on the beach who had this black van that he was selling for very cheap. And Damien decides to buy it. He was going to give the guy the money so he could get out of town. And someone broke into his apartment and stole his wallet the day he was supposed to go give money to this beachcomber guy to get the van. So, and by this point, about 6 months has passed. It's gone from July, and now we're into like early 2004. And Damien has lost weight. He looked like an Auschwitz victim at this point. He was urinating blood. He had a constant metallic taste in his mouth, which I knew was a symptom of electromagnetic poisoning. And I said, okay, look, I didn't even tell him this. I Western Unioned him the $500 or $600, whatever it was that the dude wanted for the van. And I call him on the phone. I say, look, I go, Damien, I just sent via Western Union $600. Go pick it up and get the van and just pack everything in it and just leave. If you've ever sent anyone money through Western Union, you know that you need to send them a code, and then they go to Western Union and they give them the password, and then that enables them to know, this is the person who's supposed to receive the money. So I said, let me give you the code word, and then he goes, no, don't do that, because it was very obvious that our phone calls were being monitored. So he didn't want me to give him the password at that moment, because then someone could intercept it, go to the Western Union, pick up the money, and then he would be he wouldn't have the money. So he goes, just let me throw everything. I'm going to pack. I'm going to throw everything. I'm going to pack everything, get everything ready to go. Then I will call you. You give me the password then. So I go, okay. So 2 hours later, he calls me. He goes, okay, give me the password. And I'm about to give it to him, and the line goes dead. I call him back. I'm about to give him the password. The line goes dead. That happens half a dozen times at least, same pattern. And then finally I remembered something that was unique about if you place a collect call to someone, the operator will ask the other person, will you accept the charges for the collect call? And in that moment, you can hear each other. So I placed the collect call to Damien, and the operator goes, do you accept the charges? And as she was saying that, I just yelled out a word, which I can't tell you now because it's pornographic in nature, which I knew Damien would understand was a hint as to what the code word was. And I heard Damien laugh for half a second, and the line went dead. So Damien goes, if you want to know the password, it's in the book. So Damien goes to the Western Union. He intuited what the right password was. He gave it to them. They gave him the money. He buys the van. He goes back to the apartment. He throws everything in the back of the van. Puts a sign on the door saying "I've gone west," which would be into the ocean. And then he leaves, and he goes to his landlord to tell him he's leaving. And he said the landlord couldn't have looked more relieved. Over the course of the past 6 months, the landlord had been losing weight. The landlord, it looked like he had been being poisoned. It was as if the landlord knew what was going on and just desperately wanted all this to end.
Oh my gosh, how frightening! And there's so much more I want to talk about this, but I've got a dear friend of mine and an author of Flying Saucers from Beyond the Earth, Gordon Lohr's on the phone, and he wanted to chime in. I know he's got a story about Phil K. Dick, which will be interesting, and also Jacques Vallée. So, Gordon, are you still there? Did you hang in there?
Yeah, I'm here, Erica. I'm here. Yes, indeed. Yeah, I was just looking at the chapter we're working on. Erica and I are working together on a book about her amazing life with the working title of My Journey Through the World of UFOs, Ghosts, and Psychic Phenomena, the Erica Luke story. And I'm looking at our Skinwalker Ranch section here. I'd like to quote to you a little bit about what I have. I say somewhere along the way, Chris Marks, who recently became Erica's husband, in episode 46 of John Greenewald Jr.'s popular Black Vault radio show, said that while he was at the ranch, he was aware that the studies there were sponsored by the U.S. government and that one copy of the Daily Ranch Report went to the Pentagon. It was only in late 2019 that Marks became aware of the DIA's, the Defense Intelligence Agency's Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, and that therefore the ranch sponsor was the DIA. And at an undisclosed time in late 2019, there reportedly was a conversation with another former BOS employee, a physicist, in which Marks said, quote, the physicist was aware that a senior DIA employee, one James Likutsky, was observed to be actually on the ranch sometime in 2007 or 2008. Therefore, it was clear that at least one senior individual in the DIA was interested in the ranch. So that only lends credence, I think, to the definite possibility that the CIA is still in force there at the ranch. Wouldn't you say so?
Absolutely. And I think it is really interesting because there's so many parallels, and as Robert is recounting the stories of his friends, I was looking over at Chris because he was talking about the tire tracks that he saw, and there was no vehicle behind him. But interestingly enough, that's what happened to Chris when he was on the ranch. It was a snowy night. He was walking out to the gate and felt that something was behind him. And he turned around and there were footprints in the snow. that looked like a human print that did not have any, and so this is the same type of thing. And that's why, again, I encourage people to read Chameleon. And before we go to break, Gordon, because I know that Jacques Vallée took you to see, give us a little story about that, because I think Robert might find that interesting.
Jacques Vallée took me to see what?
Didn't he take you to see Philip K. Dick's?
No.
Okay.
No, actually, Jacques Vallée, when I was there visiting him and the late Dr. Hynek, J. Allen Hynek, back in 1969, he took me to the University of Chicago Library to show me original copies of books by Jules Verne that he donated to the library.
Okay. That's interesting.
Right.
Okay. Well, see, I was thinking it was Philip K. Dick, but that's one of those things. But it is interesting.
That's right. Philip Dick, I know, was a famous science fiction writer.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm really looking forward to, Gordon is, Robert, I'll have to introduce you to Gordon sometime. Other than now we can all have a conversation, because Gordon he was with NICAP and saw the CIA infiltration and also had calls that were monitored.
I'll tell you a little story about that.
Yeah, so that
I'm
we,
sorry,
in fact,
Erica.
Oh, no,
I'll tell you a little story about that. When I was talking to Major Kehoe back about 1968, 69. Now, Kehoe lived about 100 miles south of where the NICAP headquarters was in Washington, D.C. And we were talking. All of a sudden, we got a break-in, and we heard a voice that said, well, this is Don Kehoe's outfit, Major Quintanilla. Now, Major Quintanilla was the head of Project Blue Book at the time that were just disregarding all the great UFO cases by scientists, astronomers, and others that were being sent in. So we knew our phones were being bugged that early in the stage.
It's amazing. And Gordon, you're going to be on the show, my anniversary show next week. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of these things. And I look forward to our book coming out. And I will call you after the show.
Thank you very much, Erica.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Gordon Laura's a legend, and we will have him, like I said, on the show next week. But thank you, Gordon. But Robert, at what point in time when all of these things are happening to you, do you think that you're losing your mind too? Or do you?
There was a kind of, I guess you would call it, secondary anxiety picked up because I realized that obviously they're monitoring everything Damien does, and the person who keeps calling is me. So I get, I'm Mr. Big in this scenario. I'm the guy he's reporting back to. And then I start experiencing, I wouldn't call it targeting because Damien was being targeted. He was experiencing poisoning. He was going to die if he stayed in that environment. I wasn't experiencing that. I would describe it more as obstructive incidents. If you want to flash forward a little bit into the future, I was living in Long Beach a couple of years later, and this is around the time we connect with the scientist Richard Schellinger. Damien says to me, just be careful if you meet anyone new. If you run into anyone new who seems to be overly helpful or overly interested in you, you should be careful. And I thought he was being kind of overly cautious, Despite everything that had happened, I still thought he was being overly cautious in that regard. And I said, well, okay, and he took off. And later that day, or maybe the next day, I was supposed to meet a friend of mine who had been a student of mine in the very first semester I ever taught at CSU Long Beach, and we remained in touch. She was living in New York, but she was going to be in town. She said, "You want to get together for lunch?" And I go, "Okay." So she said, "I'm going to take the bus down and meet you on the corner." Okay. I go down to the corner to meet her. She gets off the bus, and there's a guy with her who I've never seen before. And she goes, "I just met this guy on the bus." And he claimed that he was a dock worker at the docks at Long Beach. I shake his hand. He's got manicured he has manicured fingernails, and his palms are like as soft as a baby's bottom. But he claims he's a dock worker.
Oh.
And he says, "Oh yeah, I ride the 90 bus all the time." I go, "That's funny. I ride it all the time. I've never seen you." He goes, "Oh, we must take it at different times." She tells me that this guy like came up to her and started chatting with her on the bus. Now I thought, well, okay, I could see if he was like hitting on her, but instead he offers to take her and me out to lunch at this expensive restaurant that's in downtown Long Beach called 555. And he goes, "Oh, I know the maitre d'. I can get us in." And I go, "It's really expensive. We're not actually like dressed for it." "Oh, don't worry about it." He takes us to this restaurant. We're outside waiting around. I'm getting like a weird vibe about all this. My friend, she leaves to go make a phone call and leaves the two of us together. And immediately he turns to me and he goes, "Have you ever heard of Milton William Cooper?" And I go, "Yeah." And he goes, "I'm reading this book called Behold the Pale Horse by Milton William Cooper." And just the way he said it, if you look on the book, Behold the Pale Horse, it says Milton William Cooper, but no one ever calls him Milton Cooper. Everyone in UFO, they call him, Bill Cooper or William Cooper. It's like a baseball fan calling Babe Ruth by his real name. And he claims, he suddenly just brings up conspiracies and UFOs. "I'm reading this book, Behold the Pale Horse. What do you think of it?" I go, and I just start telling him the opposite of anything that he obviously wants to hear. And then suddenly he goes, "What do you think?" Now keep in mind, this is like 2005, 2006, as George W. Bush is president. He goes, "What do you think of George W. Bush?" He goes, "Don't you think someone needs to take that guy out? What do you think?" And I go, "No, I think he's doing a great job. I voted for him. I didn't really vote for him, but I said, I'm really happy with everything he and Dick Cheney are doing, and I couldn't be happier." And he seemed flustered, like it wasn't going the way it was supposed to go. Like I just kept telling him the opposite of whatever it was he wanted to hear, and he didn't know what to do. And it got stranger from there. But that's just one example of where I felt as if it's as if he wanted me to say, "Oh yeah, where's Lee Harvey Oswald when you need him?" And like I was at that point supposed to start planning a revolution, like a coup d'etat or something.
Wow.
But it's speaking by the way of Jacques Vallée. I'm reading his book Forbidden Science 4 at the moment, which I referenced earlier. But there's an interesting exchange he talks about on page 261, which occurred on August 1995 when Robert Bigelow was forming NIDS, and it's a conversation between Vallée and John Alexander.
Oh, and we're going to continue that when we get back to the break because we're going. Okay. And yes, I have that book. I have it highlighted and so many pages marked because that's really telling, and it's interesting to use people's words to paint a narrative. I am Erica Lukes here with Robert Guffey, author of Chameleon, A Strange But True Story of Invisible Spies, Heroin Addiction, and Homeland Security. We will be right back.
Listen very carefully.
This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
This is UFO Classified, live every Friday night, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. The truth is out there, just waiting to be discovered.
And now, if you will, accompany me on a journey to the future.
For more information on the host of UFO Classified, Erica Lukes, upcoming guests, as well as links to the past shows,
visit her website at ufoclassified.com.
UFO Classified.
UFO Classified.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcasting from a shack just south of Area 51.
Wait, that doesn't exist.
This is the KCOR Digital Radio Network. Now for the news.
This landed at a ranch at Corona, New Mexico. The rancher turned it over to the Air Force. Rancher W.W. Brazell was the man who discovered the saucer.
What I thought was a star began coming in my direction at a very rapid rate of speed.
The unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp, moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach.
I saw a UFO, and it went down the river, turned right at the United Nations, turned left, and then down the river.
UFO Classified.
UFO Classified.
No more plausible deniability. Fact, fiction, or the truth. You decide. And now, the new voice of the high desert, the hostess of UFO Classified, Erica Lukes.
Welcome to the second half of UFO Classified. I want to again thank all of the people that listen to my show. I get numerous messages from all over the world. I appreciate your support, and I appreciate the fact that there are actually sane people out there who are not willing to drink the Kool-Aid and actually can logically look at things. And when you look at a place like Skinwalker Ranch, all of the documentation that is coming forward, the witness testimony, all of these things that are out there, there's no doubt in my mind that people were being tested on. And if you listen to some of my other shows, that will become very, very clear. Next week, I'm going to have my anniversary show, 4 years on KCOR, and a very special person who is in my chat room, Northern UFOs, who's the biggest show supporter on the planet, is going to join me. I cannot wait for that, as well as Gordon Lohr, hopefully Barry Greenwood, and some of my dear friends. Right now, I want to just stress to you, the show tonight is something that you're going to need to listen to again and again. And then you're going to have to go back and look at some of the previous shows I've done with Chris Bartell, with Chris Marks. Look at the stories about the invisible people walking through the Bass trailer, doors opening by themselves, light coming from a room without obvious sources, tracks of invisible people that are following them, and then also moments where the sound is completely dulled and it's like they're in a soundproof room. All of these things are things that my guest this evening is talking about. Robert Guffey is an author. He's written a lot of wonderful books. We'll talk about that towards the show close. But this book we're focusing on is Camilio, and his friend had some very traumatic experiences and was experiencing this kind of the gang stalking and the kind of technology that we see and that is being deployed in theater today. And so, Robert, again, thank you for coming back. Like I said, this is and like you mentioned at the beginning of the show, it's like you put that seed out there, and now, you're watching how that over time, how people are making the connections, and that's got to make you happy to know that your work will be very important for future generations.
Oh yeah, I'm stunned actually by the response I've gotten. I could probably write 20 sequels to Camilio. The amount of information that's coming in is overwhelming at times. By the way, before I get back to Damien, that quote from Jacques Vallée in Forbidden Science, it's page 261, and Vallée is talking about on August 11th, 1995, he's having a conversation with John Alexander, and he says to Alexander, I have serious misgivings about the state of the UFO field. Ufology as practiced today is headed for disaster between bungled hypnosis and bogus autopsies. I don't want to be in the middle of that. Then he says, John Alexander was non-committal. John responds, but Bigelow needs to hear it, he said flatly. He needs to bring in people like you and Hal, who know how to do science. And then Vallée ends the section by saying, all well and good, but how will the new institute keep its data from the spooks and their puppets among ufologists? And that's how that particular section ends, which that last line, that last sentence has, in retrospect, has multiple meanings. It's really interesting. Also, before I get back to Damien, just the San Diego connection popped up again. It's amazing how many times San Diego pops up in these stories. There was an article that Vice published on November 14th, 2019. UFO researcher explains why she sold exotic metal to Tom DeLonge, and it's all about Lena Moulton Howe and how she sold the supposed metal that came from the crash saucer that Art Bell gave her back in the 90s, and she sold it to Tom DeLonge's organization for $35,000. And it said at this part, it says, while Linda Moulton Howe continued to have the metal tested, she received a phone call in July 2018 from the To the Stars organization, Tom DeLonge's organization. They call me up and say, we'd like to be able to do an agreement where you could come to San Diego and deliver the piece to us, Moulton Howe said. We've got a lab there in San Diego that we're pretty sure they're going to be able to do the terahertz test. I just thought it was interesting. I was like, where where exactly in San Diego were they going to test that thing? But getting back to San Diego, when Damien was telling me that these invisible people were attacking him, and so I got him the van, and he gets in the van and he leaves, and he calls me from a payphone on the side of the road to tell me that there are these little flying discs following him around. Now keep in mind, this is like January, February 2004. There weren't drones everywhere. In fact, it was a very little known thing at the time. There were little articles in Popular Science about drones are coming. Now people are shooting them out of the sky over Dodger Stadium. I was at the beach in Seal Beach not long ago, and a little drone flew right overhead. They're all over the place. But in 2004, they weren't. And Damien says this little circular craft, he described as a little flying saucer, was following the van. And he drove all the way into Texas, and then finally ends up in Minnesota. And at one point, he stops off at a bathroom in Minnesota, and he goes in and he's washing his hands, and a guy comes into the bathroom and comes right up to him and says, "Listen, if you just give the stuff back, this will all end." And Damien, this was the first time that anyone had ever broken the fourth wall and actually admitted that something was going on, because the whole point of the gang stalking activity is to make you think you're going crazy. So you're not supposed to rip the mask away and have the person see the machinery behind the scenes. But this guy comes in and just blatantly says, listen, just give the stuff back and all this will end. Damien said the way that the tone of the guy's voice was not like a threatening kind of tone. It was more like pleading, like, please give the stuff back, like, I'm tired of following you around. It was like this guy was breaking down more than Damien. I'm sure they were shocked that Damien hadn't died back in San Diego. I imagine these guys in their white vans, like, betting on it. You think he'll commit suicide tonight?
Wow.
I mean, who knows how many people have committed suicide in this situation?
Right.
But Damien is such a persistent son of a bitch that he just didn't give up. And I'm sure they were stunned by it. So this guy comes in to plead with them to just give up the night vision goggles so that he can stop following Damien around. Before Damien can even respond, a second guy comes in, grabs the first guy by the collar and drags him out of the bathroom as if the first guy had done something wrong. Damien is totally freaked out now, so he leaves the bathroom, gets into the van, drives off again. By this point, he had painted on the back of the van. He painted a sentence that said "gaslit" and loving it. He liked to provoke them, which probably wasn't the best idea, but he keeps driving, and he ends up, the van breaks down. And I get a phone call at like 10 o'clock at night, and this guy, I hear this voice erupt out of the phone at me. Hey, is this Professor Guffey? You know Damien? And I go, who's this? I was like, what's this now? What new darkly absurd thing is happening now? And he explains to me that this guy who had a kind of vaguely redneck southern accent, he tells me that he and his buddy picked up Damien off the side of the road and drove him back to their house. And Damien had told them the whole story of everything that had happened to him up to this point, everything I've told you. And they were skeptical. And so Damien's like, listen, just call my friend. He's a teacher at CSU Long Beach. He'll tell you. He'll vouch for me. So this guy's calling me. He's like, is this true? Are there little flying saucers following him around? Are there invisible midgets attacking him? And I go, actually, yes, that is indeed happening. As I'm talking to him, I hear the second guy go, Jeb, or whatever his name was, come over here. Outside, a little flying saucer, a little drone, is hovering outside the house. It followed them from the broken down van all the way to the house that they had taken him to, and they couldn't believe it. It was confirming everything that Damien had just told them and that I had just told them. I convinced them to put gas in Damien's van so that he can keep going, and he ends up in Winona, Kansas, which is a little town in the middle of nowhere that has 100 people living in it, literally about 100 people. And for some reason, when he got there, the harassment stopped for a while. And I don't know why. I don't know if it was just because they wanted to make him think everything was okay so they could pull the rug out from under him later on. They do that at times. Or was it because the town was so damn small that you couldn't get away with this kind of mobbing activity like you could in a big city like L.A., where no one notices anything. But if there's only 100 people and suddenly a whole parade of jarheads come running through town, you're going to notice that. Also, everyone in Winona, Kansas has a gun, so these invisibility suits do not make you gun-proof. They don't make you bulletproof.
Right.
Keep that in mind. So Damien settles down there. He kind of catches his breath. He goes on the internet. And he's trying to find anything that looks like the invisibility stuff he saw in San Diego. And he sees Professor Tashi, this Japanese inventor who created an invisibility cloak. Often they refer to it as the Harry Potter cloak. But that doesn't look anything like what he saw. And he stumbles across a website called Chameleon.net, which is the website of this guy, Richard Schoengert, and he's reading the description of the technology, and he thinks, this sounds exactly like what I saw and experienced. So he calls me and tells me about it. He goes, go look at it. So I look at the website, and I'm amazed to see that this guy, Richard Schoengert, claims to be a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason at the Scottish Rite in Long Beach. And I'm a 32nd degree Freemason at the Scottish Rite in Long Beach. So we're part of the same lodge. And I thought, if so, I must have met this guy. And he claims that he has this, that he has a top secret clearance. He works for the government, but this is a side project, or his own private project called Project Camellia, which is where the title of the book comes from. And I sent him an email. I say, hey, I'm in your lodge. It's a Scottish Rite in Long Beach. I've written these articles, stories, etc. I'd like to interview you about your optical camouflage technology. And he says, sure, we'll meet at the lodge on Saturday, and then after the rituals, you can interview me. I tell Damien decides to drive down to come meet this guy. And I'm thinking that there's like a 0.01% chance that any of this has anything to do with what Damien experienced. I mean, my expectations are low. I go, I meet Richard, I realize I have met him before. I had seen him performing in the rituals before, but I just didn't know who he was. I'd never been formally introduced to him. I say, hi, I'm Robert Guffey, and he seems like a very genial person. And he says, okay, we'll go out to lunch after this is over. So after it's over, me and Damien take Richard to George's Greek Cafe in Long Beach. We sit there, we talk for a while, and then we do the interview in my office on campus. And we don't tell him anything about Damien's experiences at first. For about the first hour and a half, we just let Richard talk. And without me having to say or prompt him or say anything, Richard confirms every single thing that Damien had already told me. He, on his own, brings up, right at the beginning of the interview, that he thought the military had stolen his optical camouflage technology. He tells me that 10 years earlier, which would have been in the 90s, the U.S. Navy and a corporation in San Diego called SAIC had come to him, and they were interested in the optical camouflage technology, and he thought they wanted to work with him and fund it. And in fact, they made a lot of noise as if they were a lot of indications that they were interested. He took him out to his lab, which is in Hemet, that he shares with Dr. Lev Berger, a eminent physicist. And they show him the lab, they show the U.S. Navy the lab, they show SAIC the lab. And they ask a lot of questions, they get a lot of information from him, they vacuum it all up, and then they leave, and they disappear, and all contact just cuts off. The door closes. He thought he was like inches away from getting funding. And then just suddenly, mysteriously, the door just slams shut. Then I started asking him, well, what applications can this have? And he just starts just entirely on his own. He says, well, obviously, there's the optical camouflage aspect, defense, the Army using this in foreign lands. But also, he goes, you could use this for psychological warfare purposes. You could make someone think they're seeing something that's not really there. You could make a tree look like an elephant. You could use this against some sort of fascist dictator and make him go crazy. He goes, in fact, that's in the original patent. And he says you could make a room look larger on the inside than it really is, like Doctor Who's TARDIS, or you can make it look smaller than it really is. Then everything that Damien had said just links up perfectly with what Richard's saying. He tells me that he's hired a lawyer to possibly sue the military. He's doing investigations, FOIA requests to try to prove that the technology was stolen. At a certain point, I turned to Damien. I go, Damien, Damien has a story to tell you. And at first, Richard, he kind of looked like he was bracing himself, like maybe we were about to sandbag him with something. Damien starts telling the story, and as Damien is telling the story, the look on Richard's face is kind of like he looks like, wait, are they like accusing me of something? Like, are they accusing me of doing this to them or something? And then finally, when Damien mentioned the thing with the mirror, that he moved the mirror and he could briefly see the invisible people in the mirror while it was in motion, he leaned forward during that moment. I could tell he was interested then. And then when Damien said that sometimes he could see them as these little dots in the air, like people who experience migraines and see these little auras, when he said that, Richard goes, he snaps his fingers and goes, that's exactly what it looks like when it's not working properly. If you don't know what you're doing, that's what it looks like. And I could see at that moment he was totally invested in it. I mean, he didn't doubt Damien at all at that moment. Because Damien's not an optical physicist. It's not a detail he would have just dreamed up on his own. And Richard said, and I have the entire transcript of the conversation is in Camilio. He says at one point, it sounds like they decided to use you as a guinea pig. And it makes perfect sense. Before you deploy this technology in a real combat situation, you want to know, let's test this out. Let's test it out in a real life situation on someone who doesn't know what's happening to them. And then we can detect and see where the flaws are. When did he see us? When did he know that we were there? As I said, the technology does not make you bulletproof, so you want to know when the technology breaks down before you actually use this in a real combat situation or in a real intelligence situation. And they decided that there are certain people who don't deserve constitutional rights, and that was the attitude. If you read the book, and particularly the conversation that Damien has with Lita Johnson when he meets her at the bagel shop with her superior, the attitude was, they made it very clear. Lita Johnson said to Damien, she talked about how she grew up in San Diego and how it used to be this wonderful place, and it was a military town. Beautiful place to live, and now there's all these drug addicts everywhere and all these homeless people and all these riffraff. And Damien has a kind of a Candide kind of quality where sometimes he doesn't know when he's being insulted. Mm-hmm. So I don't think he understood like what she was saying. What she was saying was people like you have come in and ruined San Diego. And he starts agreeing with her. He goes, oh, I know exactly what you mean. Man, these drug addicts, they get under my skin too. I know what you mean. And I can imagine the frustration rising as she's attempting to insult him, but he's not getting it. So that's very much the attitude. There are certain people who we can experiment on, and obviously, perfect. If you're a drug addict, homeless person who may or may not be bipolar or schizophrenic, if they come out and start talking about this, who would believe them?
Right. And then you have the military, the people that are serving in military. It's like, how many times have they been, subject to things? You have Native Americans, and that, when I look at everything that's happened at Skinwalker Ranch and the surrounding area, and it's just like, wow. I mean, you send in people that fit the bill for the contract, and then you let them in there. And we kept wondering why, because Chris would submit and his colleagues would submit these reports. And it's like they wanted to see if the technology was working and what happened, what were the physical effects, and they gave them, they imprinted their minds, they seeded their minds with certain things. Hey, here's Hunt for the Skinwalker, read that, and then good luck. So we're going to see how that goes. But I mean, as you and I both know, because we've been researching this, because people we care about have been involved. I mean, they've been working on holograms. One of them is a hologram used to scare a target individual to death. A drug lord with a weak heart sees a ghost, he drops dead, or a hologram of a prophet. A projection of an image of an ancient god over an enemy capital, or holograms of soldier forces. Could be a hologram of a skinwalker. You just don't know. But I mean, that's the type of things that people are specifically, and I want to just call people's attention to this. There is an article you can find, Non-Lethal Weapons Terms and References, that was written by Dr. Robert J. Bunker, who is also an associate of Dr. John Alexander. And he's an adjunct professor, National Security Studies Program, California State University, on unconventional warfare, American Military University, yada, yada. But when you go in there, he lays out all the types of non-lethal, quote unquote, weapons that are being deployed. And it is exactly, when you look at what happened with your friend, you look at what happened with Chris and his colleagues, it's like, wow, I don't know how you can deny this.
It's very often homeless people, people in mental asylums. John Rappaport wrote a book. John Rappaport, investigative journalist, he wrote a book back in the 90s called U.S. Government Mind Control Experiments on Children. And this was about how in the 50s, the MKUltra people, they were doing radiation experiments on children, which the Clinton administration did a whole investigation into. I mean, this isn't like a conspiracy theory. It was an entire government-funded investigation into this, and the president apologized for it. But they didn't talk about the other aspect of it, which when this congressional committee was investigating the radiation experiments on children that had happened in the 50s, they did not mention in their final report how this overlapped with the mind control experiments, because both were going on simultaneously. And so they used children, people in mental asylums, prisoners, and they're the perfect people to experiment on, because how are they going to complain? How is a child going to complain? And but it's also important to note that it's not just marginalized people who get into the bullseye. It doesn't matter if you do something to piss them off; they will come after you. I had a guy fly all the way from Minnesota to visit me in my office at Long Beach, who he had heard me. In fact, this was even before the book came out. He had heard me on a different radio show talking about all this, because originally there was an article in Fortean Times that I'd written called Strange Tales of Homeland Security. That was the cover feature of Fortean Times, and it was kind of a condensed version of Chameleon before the book came out. And because of that article, I was on this other radio show talking about it, and I think he must have heard that.
And I can hear that music, and so we're going to continue that story when I get back. I'm here with Robert Guffey. This is an important interview. Stick around. We've got one more set. We'll be back.
Stand by.
This is UFO Classified with Erica Lukes.
Erica Lukes.
The phone lines are open now at 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230. Worldwide callers use Skype name KCOR Radio. More UFO Classified.
UFO Classified
with Erica Lukes on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. After this.
Radio signal.
Looking for cutting-edge conversations while exploring quantum possibilities? Then look no further.
We've got to fix it.
Broadcast Team Alpha. Hosted by Nori Love and Augie Nost. They're connecting the dots and unraveling the cosmic mysteries. With interviews from top experts, embedded insiders, and whistleblowers from around the world on an array of topics. From health wellness, consciousness, and ufology, all in pursuit of the truth. Broadcast Team Alpha, hosted by Nori Love and Augie Nost. Live Tuesday nights at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. The balance of power is shifting in the world today, and the old paradigm is being replaced with a new one filled with love, positivity, and prosperity for all. The only question you have to ask yourself: are you ready for a change? Broadcast Team Alpha. Come explore the quantum possibilities.
Vegas, baby!
Vegas' #1 source for talk and new music.
How cool is that?
1 million miles till midnight. A story of timelines, artificial worlds, simulated races, and the galactic imprint. And the destiny of a blue world called Earth. 1 million miles till midnight, written by Solaris Blue Raven, is a journey through the mind's eye which allows the reader to surf a wave of technological and multidimensional intellect, revealing a bridge between conscious design and the truth. A multidimensional bleed-through awakens the world of artificial intelligence to set sail into the frontiers of a vast multiverse, morphing planets and terraforming ascended worlds beyond the linear programs of a fated race. 1 million miles till midnight will awaken, inspire, prepare, and enlighten one to the many multidimensional states of consciousness and worlds we reside in. With every cell and atom, we are this truth and multiverse. 1 million miles till midnight. Written by Solaris Blue Raven. Available now at Amazon.com. Don't wait. Get your copy today.
Alien Deceptions, a suspenseful sci-fi romance thriller by Tina Marie, featuring the tantalizing Erica Jones and the mysterious Russell Hamilton. An out-of-this-world book of fiction based on years of document facts and files the government does not want you to know about. At least, not yet. Alien Deceptions by Tina Marie. Available now at Amazon.com or get a signed copy at TinaMarieEntertainment.com. Get your copy now.
1, 2, 3, 4!
To the KCOR Digital Radio Network.
I love the way it sounds.
Love the music. Oh, I listen to.
The future of radio is here and now.
You're listening to
UFO Classified with Erica Lukes, where the truth isn't hidden beneath the black lines of a Sharpie.
That's the craziest thing I've ever heard.
To be on with Erica, call 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230. Worldwide callers use Skype name KCOR Radio.
Radio contact.
Share your thoughts on the show on Twitter by using hashtag KCOR. Or head over to the live chats at KCORradio.com.
The audience goes nuts!
And now, your host of UFO Classified.
Are you ready?
Erica Lukes.
Erica Lukes.
Welcome back to the last segment of UFO Classified. I could talk and talk all night because this is such an important subject, and the people that I bring on my show are here to expose some very important things that all of us should be aware of. My guest this evening wrote a book that is really, truly something that we will be looking at 10, 20, 50 years from now, because this is explosive and this highlights what certain contractors and the government will do to civilians and people that serve our country, and it's just mind-blowing. Robert Guffey is a lecturer in the Department of English at California State University, Long Beach, a graduate of the famed Clarion Writers Workshop in Seattle. He has authored many books, including Spies and Saucers and you've written for so many, the New York Review of Science Fiction. You wrote for Paranoia, The Third Alternative, Video Watchdog magazine. You've done a lot of different things. And I wanted to say thank you for your bravery, because I'm sure coming forward with stuff like this was not easy, as you said on the break. And so thank you. And we were talking a little bit about some of the cloaking technology and the holograms and the mind control. And I mean, what do you make of all of this? The mind control, that's the thing that we keep leaving out of this. The same people that were involved. You've got Sidney Gottlieb back in the late 60s, CIA, and then you've got little connections with Hal Puthoff, and then you've got SRI, and you've got John Alexander, Mr. Non-Lethal Weapons Testing, who's in NIDS and associated with Bigelow. It's like, wow, where is this going? And are most true believers willing to look at the facts?
Well, in the very back of Camelio, I think it's the last chapter, I talk about how I went to go see a lecture by Melinda Leslie at the Orange County MUFON, and I mentioned her in the book because we ended up going to lunch, and I was sitting next to her, and we started talking, and this is long before Camelio was published, and I started telling her about Damien's story, and I just got like a few sentences into it, and suddenly she goes, "Oh, SAIC?" And I go, what? How do you? Most people don't have SAIC like floating around in the forefront of their mind, And she just like throws that out there, and I go, how did you know that SAIC was involved in this? And she goes, oh well, she goes, you mentioned San Diego, and she goes, I've investigated like over 100 of these MIB, my lab, military abduction cases, and in so many of them are connected to this corporation, SAIC. So she just knew that. When my friend Jim and I drove to San Diego, we went to go see the headquarters of SAIC, which at that point was right across the street from the Whaley House, WHALEY, which is notorious for being supposedly the most haunted house in California. And it was just interesting that SAIC had decided to build their headquarters right across the street. Now, since then, I believe they've moved, and SAIC is split into two different organizations, one of which has maintained the name SAIC, and the other is now called Leidos, Leidos, and they're based in Virginia, appropriately enough. And so I thought it was interesting. Did SAIC pick the location across from the Whaley House so that they could use the Whaley House as a laboratory? Because we're better to test these kinds of paranormal-looking exotic weaponry that creates this kind of paranormal-like effect than to do it in an area that's supposedly haunted. So whether that's the Whaley House or whether that's Skinwalker Ranch, if something mysterious happens and you experience it, your tendency is to chalk it up to, that's that spooky Skinwalker Ranch, or that's that haunted Whaley House. And so you won't really give it a second thought, or if you do tell someone about it, it just becomes part of that folklore and mythology that has built up around that location. Alternately, it's possible that they built it there because there's something special about that geographic location. In other words, there's something about that area that makes the Whaley House so strange, and perhaps they wanted to tap into whatever that energy is, or it could be both. It's not an either or proposition. It could be both of those things. So I wanted to mention that, but also right before the break, we started talking about the fact that they very often target, children, people who are helpless, the marginalized, drug addicts, homeless people, prisoners, but that's not all they target. So, as an example of that, a guy, his name's Kevin. He's an attorney. He came to visit me in my office just before the book came out, early in 2015, and he told me this whole story about how he had represented as an attorney. He was a very successful attorney who owned his own law firm, and he had represented an African-American Muslim woman in a discrimination lawsuit against the St. Paul Police Department. And he encountered people wearing this optical camouflage technology in his basement and in his home. And he started experiencing this kind of harassment and mobbing, and eventually it got to the point where he left Minnesota. He left his law firm behind. He just threw some clothes into a suitcase and left. And he ended up in Santa Monica. He came to see me. We talked for a while. I interviewed him. Then he left. And a year later, in May of 2016, he's in San Francisco, and he sends an essay to the ACLU in Minnesota detailing his harassment because he knew someone there who worked at the ACLU. And he told me it was around 11 o'clock at night, and after emailing the essay, he gets jumped by what he thought were at least 4 different invisible people. In other words, that he could tell they were wearing the same type of optical camouflage suit that he had seen earlier in Minnesota. This was on Harrison Street, and they were sort of sparkly and similar to the way Damien described them, these like auras in the air. He could see their footsteps on the gravel, and they chased him down the middle of the street near the ballpark, put a bag over his head in an alley and just started asking him all these weird questions, like who was the football coach for the Wayzata football team in 1983? All the stuff that had to do with like when he was in high school. And if he didn't answer the question correctly, he said they told him that if he didn't answer correctly, truthfully, they were going to put a bullet in his head. And they actually put a gun against his head, and they beat the crap out of him. And he ends up in St. Mary's with a skull fracture. St. Mary's kicks him out without treating him, but luckily this cab driver picks him up and takes him to a San Francisco General, and he spends 6 days there. And when he tells the doctors what happened to him, when he says that these invisible people beat the crap out of him, they transfer him to the psych ward. So he spends 6 days in the psych ward. And then when the psychologist sees him, it turns out that the psychologist went to the University of Chicago for a psychology degree. And this guy, the lawyer, Kevin, he went to the University of Chicago for a law degree. So the psychologist says, what the F are you doing here? And Kevin says, listen, there's been some misperceptions. I got beaten up. I just need to get out of here and go back to Minneapolis, because he knows now not to say that invisible people beat him up. And the doctor says, yeah, you do. You need to get out of here. The cops hate you. You need to get out of town. And then the psychologist had to escort him out of the hospital. And the people at the front desk kept coming up with excuses why he couldn't leave. And so finally, the doctor had to go out there with him and say, you discharge this man now. And the lawyer, Kevin, he thinks if not for this psychologist, he maybe never would have left the psych ward, not alive. So he leaves the hospital, and he walks about 15 blocks from the Tenderloin to 3rd and Folsom, where he had an apartment just off Mission Street. And a car follows him all the way home, and he tapes 5 or 6 spoons around the frame of his front door. So if anybody tries to come in, the spoons would go flying onto the linoleum floor, and he'd hear it. So he goes to sleep, and around 2 a.m. he wakes up, and he hears the spoons crashing on the floor, and he gets up out of bed, and he screams, get the F out of here. And he runs into the kitchen, and the door's like wide open. So he stays up till about 6 a.m. He borrows $300 from some friends, and he goes to San Francisco International, and he gets a one-way flight to Minneapolis on a plane. And to this day, he's trying to rebuild his law practice, the one he was forced to abandon. And this was retaliation, he thinks, for winning this discrimination case. So, in this case, and here was this high-powered attorney coming to me saying, what do I do? I'm not an attorney. In other words, it doesn't matter. You could be homeless, or you could be a high-powered attorney. You could be right-wing. You could be left-wing. You could be white or black. It doesn't matter. If Lita Johnson's driving on the 405 and you cut her off and you piss her off, then you end up on the list. And this all fits into this post-9/11 Patriot Act environment of we have all this money that we need to spend, but we don't have anything to spend it on because there's no one really to spy on. The real terrorists or the dangerous terrorists are us. So what are we going to do? Well, you need to justify spending all this money. So you have to make up people to spy on. And then they have their little crypto Wikipedia page. They decide, well, maybe this person's dangerous, and how about this person? How about that person over there? It gave me a dirty look. And then they go into the database, and you start spying on them. And this justifies, as more and more money that you have to spend from this endless black budget, the more and more people get spied on.
I mean, it's just what it seems like to me, is this is, 21st century mind control, and this is disabling high-functioning human beings. And, when you look at the fact that you're using the paranormal you're mimicking the paranormal so you can get away with things. And we talked on the break about how easily it is to get in the UFO community, especially, or, you infiltrate a community like the community around Skinwalker Ranch, and you play upon some of their superstitions and things. And then you have it's wide open for this type of stuff to happen.
Well, and also I do want to point out that, so I'm not saying that there is no such, there's no real UFO phenomenon. UFO reports go back thousands of years. If you read the books of Charles Fort, he talks about invisible entities. He talks about this creature that they saw the tracks in the snow in Devonshire, England, in the early 1900s, and it was this unseen entity that you could see the tracks, but you couldn't see the being. Well, that was over 100 years ago. So I doubt that was the CIA, because the CIA didn't exist and the technology didn't exist. So, but however, I think there's two things going on. There's a genuine mysterious phenomenon, and then there are those people who are mimicking that phenomenon for their own ends. Richard Schoeninger, when I interviewed him for Nexus magazine a couple of years after Camilio came out, and I asked him what inspired you to create this technology, and he said what originally inspired him was that he was interested in UFOs. In the early 60s, he got interested in UFOs. He started reading the books, looking into it, and it seemed to him as if the UFOs had a kind of cloaking technology where it would seem to people as if they would zip off really fast. And he thought, no, I don't think they're zipping off really fast. I think that they're cloaking themselves. And then he started thinking, well, how would you do that with the technology that we have available to us now? So Richard was a Rosicrucian. He was initiated into the Rosicrucians in the 50s when he was stationed there on the island of Guam. He read up a lot about the Rosicrucians, and the Rosicrucians have a whole history of these stories about ascended masters who could cloak themselves with a kind of mysterious cloud and make themselves invisible, where it's a kind of form of hypnosis. You can make people not see you. And this, combined with the UFO research, made Richard interested in, well, how do you do this in practical terms? So, in a way, it's as if the Camilio technology is a kind of cargo cult version of some real phenomenon. You've seen the old Tarzan movies where the natives see a plane go in the sky and then they build a statue of the plane out of bamboo and they're worshiping it. It's almost like the Camilio technology is like that. Richard did the research. He observed the UFO phenomenon, recognized it as a real phenomenon, and then thought, well, how do we do our own version of that? And Richard, when he did this, he didn't do it with pernicious or nefarious thoughts. He thought, well, this could be used for national security, for patriotic. His motivations were patriotic in nature, and Richard wouldn't be the first scientist to be naive in that way. I'm writing something right now that analyzes, traces the whole history going way back to medieval times of human beings' interaction with invisible entities. And this stuff, reports of this stuff go back to occult texts and hermetic texts, all the way up into modern times. So I do think that there is a real phenomenon there, but at the same time, there's also something that's mimicking that phenomenon. And the intelligence agencies have a history of being aware of the mythology and the paranormal and UFOs and using it to their advantage. Lauren Coleman wrote a whole essay many years ago in a magazine that's sadly defunct called Strange Magazine. And Lauren Coleman talked about how the CIA had used Tom Slick. Tom Slick was a guy who was a businessman who was ostensibly interested in tracking down the abominable snowman. But it turned out later that Tom Slick was actually a CIA agent. And the CIA was using him and his investigations in Tibet, supposedly to search for the Yeti, as a cover to spy on the communists. So this whole idea of the CIA or the intelligence agencies using the paranormal as a cover for their own ends, well, they have a tradition of doing that.
And yes, they do. And this is something that I've been trying to stress on each of my shows. And it's just like, this is, you prey upon belief systems and like with the ranch, it's like you take this folklore, Native American tradition, the skinwalker, you create this story, and then you've got people that are being really severely injured around the ranch or on the ranch. And, it's people, just the most logical explanation to people who've been fed this narrative is like, oh, it was a UFO, so we're not going to look into it any further. I mean, it's absolutely, the more you step back and look at it rationally, it's absolutely insane, but this is the way things clearly work, and they've worked for decades with regard to this. And I know that, you mentioned the mimicry and kind of that chameleon effect, and we also have the 21st century version of mind control. How do we control people and do all of these really nasty things that, as you know, happened to your friend? And so where you were mentioning on the break that you spoke to your friend. Where is he now? How is he feeling?
I spoke to him just recently. I mean, he's at one point he had an apartment in the Pacific Northwest, and he was actually he experienced being tossed across the room. He actually got thrown across the room and crashed into his computer. And his roommates came in and said, "What the hell happened?" And how do you say, well, I got thrown across the room? So he said, I just tripped and fell. And he had another experience where he was making iced tea. And he, you make the iced tea, you put it on the windowsill. And he was looking forward to drinking this. And just as he was about to drink it, he just pulled open the cap and poured it over his own head. But his arm, he didn't want his arm to be doing that. Melinda Leslie told me about similar experiences that she's had, where she and her partner, Misha Johnson, were on Coast to Coast in 2000, back when Mike Siegel was hosting it. Mm-hmm. They'd been on all night, and Melinda was staying with Misha Johnson at her place in San Diego. Again, San Diego. Mm-hmm. The next morning, Melinda, they had to get in the car to drive to go to a conference in San Francisco. Melinda's getting ready, and she plugs in her hairdryer, and for no reason, she starts putting the plugged-in hairdryer. She turns on the water faucet, and starts putting it under the running water. And she did not want to be doing that. Like, her brain is telling her, don't do that. But her arm was going to put it under the faucet. And then, fortunately, at the last minute, she was able to pull back. She also, Melinda told me about a time when she was at the top of a parking structure going to work, and suddenly she felt herself moving towards the edge of the parking structure, almost as if to leap off. And again, at the last minute, she was able to break away and not do it. Misha had an experience where she was driving in traffic, and suddenly her foot started going on the gas and going through a red light, and she couldn't move her foot and prevent herself from doing this. So this is, and both Misha and Melinda are my labs. And this kind of surveillance and harassment is pervasive, and goes back many decades. I recommend reading Greg Bishop's book, Project Beta, which is subtitled "The Story of Paul Benowitz: National Security and the Creation of a Modern UFO Myth," which is all about Benowitz and Richard Doty and making him think that he was seeing things right out of a science fiction movie. In fact, there's a line from Bishop's book where he says, quote, "Apparently someone was beaming degraded video of some of the wackiest scenery this side of 1950 schlock cinema into Benowitz's receiver setup, which was located at his Albuquerque electronics company, Thunder Scientific Corporation." But when I read that line, that made me think of the scenery that Damien was seeing outside his living room window. And the way that they made Benowitz go crazy by making him think he was seeing all this science fictional stuff, it's not at all dissimilar to back in the 50s. George Hunt Williamson wrote a book called The Saucers Speak, which was all about supposedly these extraterrestrial messages that Williamson and his partner, this guy named Lyman Streeter, were getting on this radio. Lyman Streeter was this guy who he had a ham radio kind of a guy. And in the first edition of The Saucers Speak, he didn't give Streeter's real name, he just called him Mr. R. But later in 1963, they reissued the book, and Williamson talked about how Lyman Streeter, under the stress of all these supposed messages he was getting over the radio from Venus and these aliens, the stress was so much that Williamson says in the book that the extreme mental anxiety and pressure placed upon Lyman Streeter didn't exactly place him in a state of exuberant health. He was a very young man to die. So that he died because of all the stress that had been placed upon him, because he thought he was in communication with these extraterrestrials, one of whom called himself Zo, Z-O, Oz backwards. So the actual source of these messages that they were getting in The Saucers Speak, I recommend going back and reading the book. When you read it, and if you know about the Paul Benowitz case, this experience that happened back in the 50s, as written about by George Hunt Williamson, parallels so closely the Benowitz situation later on. So it's almost like this playbook is a very old playbook. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I wrote a book called Spies and Saucers. That was my second published book. It's a collection of 3 novellas that all take place in the 1950s. It's fiction, but the main novella in there, Spies and Saucers, is all about this science fiction screenwriter who gets blacklisted. And he's not even really a communist. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He can't get any work. So they get him a job. He gets offered a job by an intelligence agency to write a screenplay, a science fiction screenplay that has all these specific details in it that they want put in.
Oh, and I hate to say this because you need to be on another show. We've got like 30 seconds to show close because I've got so much to talk to you about. So, thank you, Robert, for being here. You are very inspirational. You have done work that, like I said, will be remembered for decades. And I'm working with what you have given me, and I appreciate it so much, Robert Guffey. I'll be posting your links to everything, and tell us where really quickly. Well, actually, I can hear that music. So again, thank you for listening. Stick around for Willie Miranda. Have a great night, you guys.
Listen very carefully.
This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
This is UFO Classified, live every Friday night, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. The truth is out there, just waiting to be discovered.
And now, if you will, accompany me on a journey to the future.
For more information on the host of UFO Classified, Erica Lukes, upcoming guests, as well as links to the past shows,
visit her website at ufoclassified.com.
UFO Classified.
UFO Classified.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcasting